Hi, and welcome back to our study group discussing Peter Adamson's A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, the classical Indian philosophy subseries. I'm Nerdalliun Plebz, and today with me, Rogério Marques, Pong, and Wolfie. Welcome back, guys.
Nice to be back.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we are still in the age of the Sutra after finishing the age of the Veda. We're more or less in the middle of it. We've discussed several schools. Graham should be back in no time after dropping out, hopefully. Anyway, we brought for your enrichment visual aids. And we hope you will like this intro to the Nyaya's take on perception and reasoning, particularly logical inference. Okay, so we will be, as in the previous session, looking at Gautama's writings and his commenters. Here we are attempting to depict the second individual, Vatsyayana, and then there's Udayanaka. So these three will be the main sources of the session. And so, well, Nyaya on perception. So Vatsyayana, this fellow commenter of Gautama, he distinguished three kinds of remarks made by Gautama. So helping us to figure out the composition, the content of the source text of the tradition of Nyaya, the Nyaya Sutra. So the first one is naming sutras, which introduce a topic concept for knowledge. So they just name things so as to serve as an intro. Then there are defining sutras that give a description, a definition of whatever the concept that is being exposed. And then there are critical sutras, which look at the how strong and reliable is a definition or a position in the Nyaya Sutra. And one of these positions are definitions, which can be either undercovering or overcovering. When I was researching this episode, I noticed that Vatsyayana is actually also the name for another Indian author who wrote a text that is way more known than the Yoga Sutra Bhashya, which basically is a commentary that this Vatsyayana wrote. So this other Vatsyayana, who is not the Vatsyayana of Nyaya, was a Vatsyayana who wrote the Kama Sutra, well, which is unfortunately people in the West know this one, but they don't know the philosophically enriching materials like the ideas that come from the Nyaya. So just to clear this out, if people will then check out Vatsyayana and find themselves finding the texts that we are commenting here.
Well, I think we have a richer understanding of what a sutra is these days, and like we have the Nyaya Sutra and the Yoga Sutra and the Mimamsa Sutra and the Vedanta Sutra and all this.
Yeah.
And I think once you understand that Kama refers to body, you understand the Kama
and
Sutra
maybe
is
if I understand. We had some interruption in the connection, maybe. Please go on.
Yeah, I didn't hear you there for a while. I didn't know if it was my connection or your connection, so I just kept quiet and waited.
Okay, yeah. Kama might mean body, might mean bodily pleasure. I'm not sure. Did you check it out, perhaps?
That's from a long time ago. I may have to double fact check myself about the meaning of karma.
Yeah. I think in a few sessions we will also discuss the school that is related to hedonism, which might go into the definition of what Kama actually means, even though maybe these weren't the guys that wrote the Kama Sutra.
Yeah, so sutra means thread in a way we've come to know it, but I do think I was incorrect about Kama, because the first definitions I got just by fact-checking myself, Googling, it says variously means desire, pleasure, love, or sex. So not body necessarily.
Yeah, so the title is self-explanatory, and it says what it contains. But moving on with Niyaya and perception and logic as well. So there's this thing about defining terms that's important for philosophers. Well, Gautama one-ups many philosophers, and he even defines definition. So his definition of definition is a sound definition, which is a laksana, provides some property that is coextensive with the concept to be defined. So coextensive builds upon what I previously mentioned. It cannot be too overly encompassing, and it cannot be too short. So it cannot be undercovering, like we gave an attribute that doesn't cover the entire group, or overcovering because we gave an attribute in the definition that is also a property of other items that are outside of the group. So basically, a proper definition strikes a balance between those two extremes. One example that was given by Adamson was a cow is something with a tawny color. Well, yeah, many cows are tawny in color, but they are also white with black spots and many other combinations of colors. An example of over coverage to attempt to define cow is something with horns, but then people will point out that clearly there are many other beings with horns, like reindeer and antelopes, etc. But then he, in his in his Niyaya Sutra, gives the definition that a cow is something with a dewlap, and a dewlap is a fold of skin hanging from the cow's neck. That is an attribute that only cows have, and so he gives a definition that is useful to point out cows from other animals, from other stuff, but it just falls short of that. It doesn't at the same time give us the essence of cowness. So it's useful in practical terms to teach a child, look, this is a cow, now you can be a shepherd, and go on milking the right animals or something like that. But it won't kind of give people who are interested in biology, this is the proper taxonomic definition of a cow, and this is very strong, and no one can add or subtract to it, not in a million years. And this is not the case. It seems like he was trying to give people a practical definition of cow, even though his definition of definition it seemingly is more ambitious. So I found it interesting how there is a contrast between his definition of something that is very philosophical, while the definition for a cow, which well, it's a very different subject, but he just gave a less ambitious definition. Then well, then there's the definition of perception, pratyaksa. So for Gautama, perception is a perceptual experience. It's that which is produced from contact between sense faculty and object, firstly. Secondly, is a non-verbal avya padashaya awareness, does not deviate or err from its objects, avya bikara. And fourthly, is definite, vyavasyayatmika. This is a mouthful. In character. So it's definite in character. So this definition, possibly it is a sophisticated definition, maybe thanks to the Buddhists, maybe thanks to the Buddhists being nagging the Nyayas with their criticisms, their objections, the debates between Nyayikas and Buddhists. Maybe it fertilized the soil for this very nice definition to grow from. It's a quite sophisticated definition, which occupied Adamson during almost all the episode on on perception. So basically, the episode on perception was to break down the definition by Gautama on perception and see what it means. And so, yeah, well, the Buddhists. It's important also to mention that since I've figured out how to pluck nice-looking images from AI, I also figured out that spooking Nerdalliun with imagery from Buddhists in Buddhist temples would be amusing. Yeah, well, just remove yourself. You're not in a Buddhist temple. It's okay. So their definition of perception is also relevant to contrast with Gautama's from the Nyaya's definition of perception. So the Buddhists are a bit more, have a bit more concise definition, which goes like, it's a kind of direct sensory acquaintance with sensible data like color, sounds, and smells. So it's not so rigorous, I would say. It's also relevant to mention that perception was important for Buddhists because for them, suffering is caused by attachment to false ideas and constructs of the mind, such as the notion of a permanent self, and belief in essences that belong to everyday objects. After non-attachment is attained, what remains are just simple perceptions. So basically living in the now and just letting go of everything else, memories, beliefs, etc. So the perceptions are the remaining residue for the Buddhists of mental life. This is why the Buddhist definition emphasizes the immediacy of our sense experiences. Perception untainted by false premises, by false theoretical postulates. So it's kind of like the Buddhist idea of looking at the world like a child, a newborn child that's seeing everything from the first time. They kind of value that. It might not be the way to see the world that is the be-all end-all, but it might have some merits to see things without tinted shades, so to speak. But they went to go all the way with this, according to this episode of Adamson, which might be a bit reckless. So breaking down Gautama's nice definition, it's into bullet points. This Nyaya definition of perception is also characterized by having a more humble objective. It just seeks to articulate our ordinary common sense notion of what constitutes a perceptual awareness. So they don't go all spooky, otherworldly metaphysics here. All of this that is stated here in the definition is actually more or less testable in our daily lives. And we might have even tested these premises in our daily lives just by living our lives. So let's see how this holds up. So the first one, perception must involve a direct sensory connection or causal link between the object of perception and perceiver. So one question we might ask is, do we really see a person when we see a picture of them, like a picture of a dear friend or a family member? Do we really hear them when someone else tells us what they said? So my opinion is no. We see reproduction. So we are perceiving the reproduction and not the actual thing. And if people confuse the reproduction with the actual thing, they might kind of feel all fuzzy by seeing a photograph of a deceased loved one without yet having learned the news of the deceased loved one. And by seeing the photograph, they kind of ask, so where can I see this loved person? And then someone informs them of the regrettable news, and they are grief-stricken. And maybe their grief is even increased because they might have this sensory stimuli by looking at the reproduction in photograph of the loved one, might have increased their expectations of seeing that person soon or something like that. So I would say that's really important to have a present awareness of what is a reproduction and what is the real thing, or at least think about this philosophically. So here we have Udare Anaka, who tells us, the third commenter, who tells us about perceptual connection. So this first object of the definition, and he goes and says, well, this first concept can be subdivided into 6. We can connect sensibly with the objects of our sensation in 6 types of ways. Direct conjunction, for instance, when we see an object in front of us, it's there. Perceiving something that inheres in an object. For instance, we see an object that has a color, and we see both the object and the color, the quality that inheres in the object. We can perceive something that what inheres in something that inheres. So an example is perceiving the universal property of blueness in an object in which you perceive a blue color because it is a blue-colored object. So a person can, by perceiving, cogitate and think about what they are perceiving, and they can kind of see that their perception maybe has several layers according to the Nyayas. They're seeing the particular, they're seeing the qualities, and they might be also seeing the universal that is attached to these qualities. Fourthly, perceive that a property inheres in something. Fifthly, perceive that a universal inheres in something. So basically, it's the other way around from 3 for both the quality and the universal, and also the 6, which is the more innovative, I'd say, perceiving the absence of an object. So for Udyatukara, we perceive much more than objects themselves. We also perceive their qualities, properties, and motions, and also their absences. So here is the example of the blue pot. So an abstract universal like blueness cannot by itself make us perceive its quality. We cannot see universals directly. Its quality must be inherent in a perceivable object. And then our sense faculty is directly conjoined with the object in which the universal inheres and allows us to kind of extract all these components of perception. The object itself, its qualities, and also the universals, perhaps by inference actually, because the universals, if universals are something, we are never seeing them directly. So universals, as I said, we cannot perceive them directly, and they only appear located in particulars.
Oh, Rogério cut out.
By perceiving directly. We seem to have had a cut out here.
You're back now.
Okay. So I think I was in the third point, and you guys listened to the previous points anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? Yeah, okay. So we can only perceive universals by perceiving the particulars in which they occur. Well, just to restate what was previously presented. And then as for the absence, when we perceive the absence of something, this actually prompted questions in my mind by listening to this concept. So are we perceiving the absence directly? Like literally every piece of empty space could be an absence, I would say, of something, even things that we can't even imagine just because we've never seen them in our lives. We cannot perceive a being that we've never seen in an empty piece of space. So my question is, are we inferring from the lack of perception that there is an absence? But if it's an inference, the inference would need something else than just experiencing the empty space, the empty chair, or something like that from a school kid that likes to skip class or something like that. That was the example given by Peter Adamson. As the Buddhist Dharma Kirti, so another Buddhist here to spook people. We do not really perceive absence, but rather make an inference from a lack of perception, which is called anupalabdhi hetu. So we make an inference from a lack of perception. Udyatukara says, we really do sometimes perceive an absence. I found it interesting that he used sometimes, the qualifier sometimes. And he adds, absences can inhere in objects just as colors do. The absence of a student from the chair he usually occupies is a qualifying property of such chair. To me, it seems a bit arbitrary and more likely connected to memory, which tells the perceiver that the chair is normally occupied by the particular student. So it seems that it's not a pure perception here. There are other cognitive things going on, but let's go on and see, because the Nyayikas give us another example. Suppose I am told to get some cloths from a pile of fabric, to take the ones that are not marked, so not striped, for instance. What I'm looking for is the absence of stripes on the cloth. When I see this absence, I know I should take the cloth. So, yeah, well, fair enough. But we can also perceive when the fabric is clean, is clear of stripes, and that's what we are looking for by basically complementary logic. So they ask us for not one thing, and so we ask for the thing that is complete. It has a quality that completely excludes stripes or marks. Well, I'm not completely sold on this idea that we can perceive absence anyway. But well, that's what Gautama wrote in his Nyaya Sutra. Also, Nyayikas were determined to resist Buddhist attempt to expose the experienced world as one of conceptual fabrication called prapanka. And they would say, experience puts the world in view. What you see is what you get. Versus the Buddhists who say, the experienced world is a conceptual fabrication. Again, prapanka. And so Nyayas then say, vision reaches out to the visible object. This is actually a concept that I think we've heard from ancient Greece. I'm not remembering from who. There was some ancient Greek philosopher who thought that from the eyes something kind of like feelers would shoot forward and even touch the sun, basically to tell them that there's the sun. While Buddhists say, if vision really reached out to things, it would see closer things before seeing things that are further away. A bit like if you see, as Adamson would have it, a giraffe in front of the moon. We would see the giraffe before we see the moon. Well, physics to the rescue. We have determined the speed of light, and we realized that we've learned that the speed of light is actually a finite quantity, and there actually is, if we turn on the light of the sun, if we had that chance, we would probably see the giraffe before we see the moon, arguably, assuming that it's daytime and the Earth is closer to the sun than the moon. But either way, the moon would be farther from us. It would take some extra time from the reflected sunlight to come to us. But it's really fast. It's a mere split seconds from the moon to the Earth. I don't remember the exact time. I just know that it's more or less 8 minutes from the sun to the Earth-Moon system, and then since the distance from the moon to the Earth is a fraction of the astronomic unit, it's probably seconds or much less than seconds. Anyway, Nerdalliun seems to be typing out to figure it out.
Yeah, quick Google search. It's 1 1/3 seconds.
Oh, okay. So it's more than 1 second. Okay. So fair enough. Maybe it would be perceivable then if the Earth-Moon system would be arranged in such a way that we could just shut the sun off and on again, like people do with computers, but very quickly, so we don't freeze to death. And then we could see the giraffe first and then the moon with 1 1/3 second of difference. So we would need to not blink. Yeah. And then, well, the idea of this example from the Nyaikas that I found really interesting, really, it's an aesthetically pleasing example that mixes very delicate objects, petals, and very cutting and acute object, a knife. So they say, the Nyaikas say, vision does indeed contact more distant things slightly later, but the speed at which this happens is such that we are unaware of the lapse in time. So kind of foreshadowing that the speed of light is incredibly fast. So that I find that really interesting. Then they say, when I thrust a knife through a pile of flower petals, I'm not aware of cutting through each petal separately, even though the knife must indeed pass through them one after another. So they're just pointing out that our sense perception has its limitations here concerning the dimension of time. So sometimes things happen in a sequence, such a tight sequence in time that for our concerns, we perceive it as simultaneous, basically. So this we've already went through. So the second one is perception is a non-verbal awareness. I find this really interesting due to the conceptions of mysticism that I've been also delving into. When people have experiences that might be called hallucinations, dreams, etc., or seeing something for the first time, like us seeing an animal that we've never seen in our lives. It might be not even be a quadruped or something like that. Like people from sci-fi authors imagine first contact between humans and another extraterrestrial species. Probably it would be jarring for us. We would have no comparison to make ready at hand, and of course no name to attach to them. So we would need to have a kind of an initial period of figuring out what name to give them, what name would make sense, and even to draw comparisons with things that we already know from Earth that might help us to figure them out a bit better. So perception as a nonverbal avya padashya, a nonverbal awareness. The Buddhists, we should strip away conceptual generalizations from perceptual experience. So no, everything nonverbal. No, don't use words and conceptions and whatnot. So abandon all augmented reality, even mathematics and scientific models and whatnot. So maybe this is kind of strawmanning the Buddhists a bit, because I know that the Buddhists studied astronomy and whatnot. So they actually wrote things down by observation and whatnot. So maybe some of them were saying this, but I think not all of them. It's a very big and heterogeneous tradition. But anyway, these that Peter Adamson was quoting said this to strip away conceptual generalizations from perceptual experience. And then our Gautama would say nonsense. Although I can indeed perceive something without classifying it in terms of some concepts, I can also deploy concepts to enrich my perceptual experience. So this basically reminded me immediately of Terminator vision, augmented reality, etc. So stuff that helps people or beings or individuals to piece out what they are seeing and classify and focus or whatnot. Gautama also adds that it is also possible to have a mere sensory connection with an object without having the capacity to recognize what sort of object is being encountered. Like when you show a giraffe to an Indian who has never seen a giraffe in his life, an ancient Indian, namely. The Indian might react and say, wow, what a tall cow, but it's missing its dewlap. So basically, it would be attempting to compare this novelty with something that has already been registered in their database of concepts in their minds, to try to also register this one inside the database in a way that makes sense to relate to other relatable things. For one thing, the giraffe is also a quadruped, and if they would stare at giraffes for enough time, they would figure out they are also mammals as well. As for the Buddhists, they would say all perceptions are like seeing that unnamed, very tall, four-legged spotted animal. So all perceptions are like seeing things for the first time ever. Then to give this a dialogue tone, I really like the dialogue format. Gautama would say, although I do agree that some perceptions are devoid of conception, as when we are seeing something for the first time, I disagree with your generalization. Such unvarnished encounters with the world are not even the typical case. Not all perceptual experience is non-verbal or non-conceptual. So Gautama's understanding of human experience is rather expansive, and it seems more philosophically rigorous than the one we are showing here, portraying the Buddhists as having. As well, it seems reductive. It seems that it reduces everything to non-verbal, non-conceptual experience. Then the later Nyayakas would add, so Uttarayanaka and Vatsyayana. Vatsyayana first. There are two kinds of perceiving, which is called nirvikalpaka. I'll write it down here for you guys. Nirvikalpaka and Savikalpaka. So Nirvikalpaka, when our conception is Nirvikalpika and Savikalpika. So Nirvikalpika is when we are seeing a perception for the first time, and Savikalpaka when our conception is conception loaded, so with Terminator vision or augmented reality or Cartesian mathematics or something like that. And then as for the third clause from the definition of perception, perception does not deviate or err from its object. So a quite tighter definition of experience of perception than we have in our everyday lives. And I think it will become plain here. Gautama seems to be including this to distinguish genuine perceptual experience from illusions, hallucination, and other types of perceptual error. So we would even like to ask him a question thus. So surely, Gautama, surely perceptions that are erroneous still count as perceptions, right? For instance, taking a coiled piece of rope to be a snake. Would we be correct to say that a snake is being perceived while there is no snake present? And he would say, illusions cannot be counted as instances of genuine perceptual experience. So when we see something that is not, that in further investigation, maybe sometimes even split seconds after we see what seems like a snake in the corner of our eye in a poorly lit room, and it's actually just a coiled rope, probably the fault is on us for adding to what is just a coiled object, adding it some other quality that is taking a huge leap, a huge inference leap, a huge logical leap, basically. So as you will see, he quite advises people within reason to withhold judgment until we can further verify things. In the case of a rope being initially perceived as a snake in the corner of our vision, we just need to calmly turn and don't make any jump any sudden movements and whatnot. We don't want, if the hypothetical animal that is there is actually there, we also don't want to make it panic into attacking us or something like that, or doing something stupid. So just calmly, like Sherlock Holmes or something like that, a cold-blooded person, a calm person would turn and verify. And then the later Nyayakas, Vatsyayana Uttarayanaka, we have developed a whole theory of cognitive error. In every perceptual experience, whether veridical or erroneous, there is something that is somehow in contact with the senses. So going back to the example of the rope that might be confused with a snake, the senses gave correct information. So they showed a figure that is coiled, apparently long. But it was the cognition that incorrectly applied the property to the thing in question. The individual wrongly applied the concept of snake. There was coiled and brownness in the object, two attributes shared among many ropes and many snakes. Snakes are real, just as ropes, and so it's just that there is no snakehood present in the rope, and that can be verified by having a bit more patience with actually attaining a genuine perception instead of yeah, go ahead.
Maybe just switching on the light might help, Rogério.
Yeah, exactly. To kind of, if we sense that our senses are not in their best elements, there is something interfering with our senses, like the lack of light. That's a good example. Then it's really the wisest thing to correct that, to either turn on a flashlight, light a match, so long as there's no smell of gas, or flip the switch. So yeah. That's
So
the thing.
that might be part of the problem. Maybe he was inhaling gas when he saw that rope and started tripping out.
Yeah. Well, also other things that might make our perception go wrong is our we are intoxicated in some form or some fashion. Yeah. So moving on. Also, the later Nyayikas, they have also come up with another concept, this Jnana Lakshana Pratyasapti, which means presentation through revived memory. So, for example, when you have already touched ice, in future, when you see ice, you can see the coldness in the ice. You can kind of imagine yourself touching the ice without touching it, and imagine, oh, okay, this feels cold, and so maybe it will even deter you from touching it because you can already imagine the coldness. But you can also just be looking at a shard of glass and making a huge amount of fuss over nothing. So that would be a mistaken situation. So not a genuine perception. Seeing ice in a shard of glass, that to make it into a genuine perception, you would actually need to touch it to kind of rule out the potential mistake. Then to go back to Peter Adamson's prime subject, with all this, the Nyayikas are presupposing the aforementioned distinction between concept-laden and concept-free perception. So we can see a giraffe as a giraffe, rather than just as an inexplicable object taking, as they are large, taking up most of the field of view. He even played with words, taking the lion's share of the field of view as something that would even potentially startle the giraffe. So also, if I see a rope as a snake, then I cannot say that I'm having a genuine perception. So again, to reinforce what I just said, because of the high bar raised by the Nyayikas, everything that we might think counts as a perception, like literally everything that we see, hear, touch, smell, taste, for the Nyayikas, it's only a perception if we actually confirm the identification of the objects beyond a doubt. So it does not deviate from its object, as this third part of the definition goes through. For this example of the snake or the rope, you do not see the snake instead of the rope. So we're not misidentifying the object according to them. You just describe the rope incorrectly as having snakehood, as having a property, misdescription basically. So it's kind of like operating in the level of language, more of concepts, and not so much at the level of non-verbal perception, I'd say, as it seems. This is because underlying every concept-leading perception is always at first a concept-free perception, and these examples seem to explain the power of a skillful skeptical attitude towards empiricism. Sorry. Then we could ask them, hey Nyayikas, how can you explain situations in which no object is perceived at all, like hallucinations? Or for instance, we are constantly assuming we see a blue sky. But what is truly happening is just blue light that is scattered from sunlight hitting the atmosphere. Do we have a perception without an object? They would say the perceiver superimposes the property of blueness onto empty space. And we might say, well, that does not look terribly plausible. That space would be the perceptual object. I would even add that when we see the blue sky, we're actually indirectly seeing something that is an effect of the sun, basically. So it's a bit like we are seeing a reproduction or an effect of a cause that is the sun, with another cause, which is the nitrogen, mostly in our atmosphere, that is scattering the blue light of the part of the light that's coming from the sun,
which is refraction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe diffraction, actually. I think refraction is when things pass through a tight hole, or it's the other way around, maybe. Yeah, I think it's refraction, and diffraction is when light passes, or a wave passes through a tight space, a tight hole. Yeah. And yeah, we tend to look at the sky as being an object. The sky is a big white blue object, and in fact, it's just an illusion, a bit like the illusion when we dip some straight object into a glass of water, and the object seems to bend where the interface is between the air and the water. Again, it's something that is bending light in a way that is not common for these conditions in which we perceive things. It's a deviation from the normal conditions of optics, and thus if things deviate from the normal conditions of optics and other mediators for our senses, then we need skeptical inquiry, and we need testing and science and etc. to figure things out. Rainbows, lightning, and etc. Then for the fourth one, perception is definite, vyavasya yatmika, in character. So we might ask, when we perceive a person at a distance without the ability to definitely distinguish, it is a person. Is the experience a perception in your definition? And Gautama would say, no, because the genuine perceptual experiences must leave no room for doubt. The mere fact that you are seeing something that you make as neither a person nor a wooden post prevents the experience from being a pramana. Pramana is, again, a valid source of knowledge. Also, he would add, a perception may be non-verbal or concept-free. Again, they go back to this idea. Rudimentary perceptual experience is not infected by doubt. So at least it's not committing any mistakes, even though it doesn't land on the correct answer. And he would add, since it involves seeing the object out there, neither as a person, nor as a wooden post, nor as anything else. So kind of withholding judgment, because we have realized, that's a tricky way, a tricky thing to realize, actually, to realize that we are lacking data or information to make a call, basically, to make a judgment on whether the thing that we are perceiving in the distance is a person or a post. And then the Buddhists would interject, all our perceptual claims are really disguised inferences. When I look at an object, I never see the whole thing, but only the part that is facing me. It is by inference that we mentally complete the rest of the object that is occluded from view. And this would challenge Gautama to say something like, the argument seems to concede that I can perceive something without making an inference. I can perceive the part of the giraffe that is facing me. And the Buddhists, here I put the word skandhas here because it's part of their answer. So the Buddhists would say, whole entities do not exist, just like a whole chariot is really just a collection of parts. What we conceive as persons are really merely skandhas, so collections of mental and physical processes. All perception of objects involves inference. To which Gautama would say, we can perceive wholes the same way we perceive universals. Well, here's an example for you guys, which having more or less my age or more, you have seen Jurassic Park at once in your life for the first time, I believe. And who remembers that scene where we would see what seems like a person's arm, and this character just pulls the arm and says, "Oh, I'm so happy to have found you," and it's a detached arm. And so in the split second before the frames show that it is a detached arm, we were kind of fooled into thinking that the character, the living character, actually found another character that was still alive, and they only found their detached arm. So the dinosaurs maybe stored it as a snack for later or something like that. But I was fooled. I was fooled because when we realize that it's an arm, we go all uncanny, and it's quite an experience. We get quite startled. Anyway, I was kind of like 6 or 7 at the time. And well, this is so much for perception. So we've encountered the sages, the hermits in the woods, and thus it's time for me to tag out and you guys to go on.
Yeah, I have a couple of notes that I want to comment on. First is a question, like, is we started with the Nyayas last week, so maybe just a recap of where in the timeline we are again and how that relates just to some of the other things. So I don't know if you have maybe your prior. I remember last time you had a timeline that's in your prior slides that we can view. So while I'm talking about the other stuff, maybe you can.
I'll get it.
Search for that. So I'd like to fill out maybe a little bit of the motivation for them having so much to say about perception, because it can seem a little unmotivated and disconnected from life. So the way I understand what the Nyayas are up to is they're trying to create a system for reaching liberation from suffering and being in the tradition that affirms the Vedas, that teach that the most important thing is to understand the nature of the self, like the true nature of the self. There we go, and that's the timeline. So we were discussing mostly, or only the Nyaya Sutra and the Nyaya Bhashya. Is that correct today?
And also a bit of the Nyaya Vartika, the third volume by Udaya Tukara.
All right, so that'll be just after the time of Christ and just before Muhammad from Islam, just to put that in the more or less the time frame of the Western tradition or the European tradition. What I was going to say about the motivation is, so yeah, they're trying to affirm that a true understanding of the self is the way to liberation, and so what they want to do is have a doctrine of the nature of the self and the nature of how understanding that leads to liberation. And part of the reason why they're constantly debating Buddhists is because one of the way the Buddhists have sort of created an alternative, one might say a heretical, from the perspective of the Vedic school, religion, is to deny that there even is a self. So whereas understanding the true nature of the self and then having that as a core part of reaching liberation, the Buddhists kind of deny that, and they have their own teachings of how to achieve liberation. And yeah,
but liberation for whom at that point?
Yeah. But so a lot of their argument comes in the form that some of the straightforward answers of back and forth has been, I think, something like, well, the Vedic affirming schools would argue from some of the things we perceive about the world or about ourselves, and leading then, well, at least the Nyayas, I think, would say that, well, the fact that we perceive things means there has to be some kind of subject of perception, and that's more or less how they argue for the self. But maybe I don't want to go too much into the motivation on that line of thought. Like another part of their motivation is that they think the core root of suffering, as opposed to what the Buddhist thinks, is, or close to what the Buddhist think, but not exactly the same, is misperceptions and incorrect knowledge. So mistaken beliefs, essentially. And so they think the cure for all suffering is acquiring true beliefs about especially the nature of the self, and then also avoiding false beliefs. And if you can manage that, have true beliefs and avoid false beliefs, you'll find liberation that way. And so they consider epistemology, or the study of how to acquire true knowledge, very important. And also, I think the Buddhists lay a challenge in that, like sort of skeptical challenges to those knowledge claims, and especially to the methodology, in saying that one of the challenges some of the Buddhist philosophers would claim, or would level against the Nyayas, is a challenge of a regress. So saying, like, much of the claims that the Nyayakas make, they don't really know and they're mistaken about. And the way we can know that is because all of their justifications require them a pramana, a source of knowledge, that's then justified by a further source of knowledge, that knowing that the first pramana is a valid source of knowledge, and you can keep that going into infinity, or at least conceptually you can do that, but practically you can never do that. So since they haven't ever done that, they don't really know. And part of their response is that no, epistemology bottoms out in perception. You can know things because you perceive them, and you don't need to know that your perception is a correct perception. Just if your perception is correct, you know it because you have a correct perception. And I think that's part of the reason why they go in quite detail what they mean by perception and what they mean by having a correct perception, and defining very carefully their terms and the ways that can go wrong and not count as a real perception, because they want to say, well, all of my justifications bottom out in my perceptions, and my perceptions are these true contact with objects. And so I think that just helps understand, because it can seem a little pedantic, just how much detail they get into the definitions. But I think Rogério kind of pointed out that probably a lot of those fine points was developed in conversation with critics, and saying, what about this? You don't know what you're talking about. And then they have to explain, like, no, okay, that gets something subtle a little bit wrong, and then have to clarify that's the subtle distinction in this case and a subtle distinction in a different case. But it's towards the end that they can have their theory of knowledge be founded in a theory of perception, or that knowledge begins in perception. And that idea that knowledge begins in perception, I think, is quite similar to what Aristotle said, so it feels quite familiar and safe. And just as a point of, like, a bit of humor, like, in the whole slideshow, my mind kind of perceived all the Nyayakas as Jedi and all the Buddhists as Sith. So yeah, like, this epic cosmic battle against good and evil, with the Nyayakas being the good ones. That's an example of a concept-loaded perception, I think. So what's it? Savi Kalpaka. Yeah, and I tend to agree with the idea that, like, concept-loaded perceptions can enrich life, and there are lots of examples. But just one example that wasn't discussed to add to the discussion is sort of the way in which you might perceive a face. Like, if we're having a video call, I might just perceive beige here, lighter beige here, darker beige here, dark brown here, dark brown there, dark, like the Buddhists sort of say. Or I could perceive features like those are eyes, that's a nose, and that's a mouth. Or I could sort of start seeing those features come together in different shapes, like, oh, the eyebrows are making an inverted triangle, or they're making a triangle, upward pointing triangle, or the mouth is making an upward triangle. Or I could start putting meaningful labels to that, like, oh, that's the eyes are frowning, or the mouth is smiling, or the nose is scrunched up, whatever. Or I can have, like, higher level concepts and start to see the frowning face as anger, or see the smiling face as happiness. So I can look, oh, happy face, angry face, sad face, fearful face. And for practical purposes, having a conversation with someone, maybe operating at that level, the higher conceptual level, can be a useful shortcut that no doubt can go wrong and does go wrong. So concepts can be incorrectly applied, and I like that the Nyayikas kind of has stuff to say about how yes, it can go wrong, and then when it can go wrong, they just said it's improper to call that a perception. So if you perceive someone who's frowning because they're confused as angry, like you've not perceived confusion, you've that's in their case it wouldn't be a perception of anger. I'm not sure what kind of name they have for that kind of error. So the thing that actually happened, if they have a word for that, or if I missed that. Have misperception.
Well, I also didn't see, but I'll check it out. I think the timeline is no longer needed, right?
Yeah, I like the. I think that's enough. So yeah, so I think.
Can I just ask something quickly? In all this sort of stripping back of the nature of reality and what is perception and what are we actually observing, right? And the concepts underneath that define our reality, right? Where do they factor in the imagination in their thinking? Like where does that come in? Is it just like, because you were saying, you know, the concept of, you know, you saw the Irons as the Jedi and, you know, the Buddhists as the Sith, but like that's your imagination running wild with this sort of perception of the two, you know, and that like where do they fit in with that? Like both the Buddhists and the Irons, like where do they sit on the factor of imagination? I mean, because that certainly fills in a lot of gaps, and if you can leap to conclusions that are way outside of logic, you know, I mean, like, and you know, that are beyond your perceptions, and just imagine something to be a certain way. I mean, that fills in a lot of gaps, and it can kind of get you places where you completely put logic aside and you go somewhere else. I mean, where does that factor into this school of thought on both sides?
Yeah, it looks like Rogerio's looking that up. I'm not sure either. I also was kind of hoping they'd have a word for something like hallucination, but it seems to have an explanation in terms of other words for what happens there. I bet in the later Nyanya school they do have terms for that. Because after this, I think, so we're here up to around 600 AD. I think about another 600 or 700 years after that, they sort of standardized a very rich vocabulary for doing philosophy in, and we haven't really covered that. And I bet in that there would be terms that either directly for things like imagination and hallucination, or terms you could easily do. You can combine to point at the same thing. But at the moment, they, so far as what Peter Adamson has covered, they haven't too much to say about imagination or art in general, or creation. They're more concerned with just the correct knowing of reality as it is. And yeah, so I have a couple of things to say about like their maybe a bit of their ontology, because it's related to the epistemology. I think they're straightforward realists in that they think objects exist, and they're realists in an interesting way. So they're at least in Western philosophy of mind, a recent brief little breakdown of what I saw kind of divides views up into materialism, idealism, dualism, and functionalism, where materialists think there are only physical objects, and idealists think everything only exists in sort of a mental realm of existence, so everything is mental. Dualism sees reality as comprised of both those things. There's mistaking one object for another. Good luck reading it, yeah. Sadanta, Ramsadanta, Ratma Nahrahayate. I think I missed a couple of...
That sounds like an Indian version of Mary Poppins right there.
Maybe it's the word that says what it is. Basically, it signifies a signifier and signifies itself as well at the same time. Because you can...
It's more of a phrase than a word.
Yeah, it's a composite one.
Anyway, I was on about materialism and idealism and dualism, and then functionalism is a different notion, but specifically relates to the philosophy of mind more than ontology in general. But what's interesting to me is they have this realism that it's kind of naturalistic, but it's not straightforwardly materialist, because they do have these kind of metaphysical things like universals and properties and qualities, and it's also not like directly dualistic, because they don't split it into two realms. So they have like a list of things and that exist, and they're not all of the things that exist. They're not all material things, and neither are they all ideal things or mental things. It's kind of a mix of different kinds of existing things, and I thought that was quite interesting. But so for on a slightly different subject, I'm just going through my notes in a somewhat chaotic order. On the perception of absences, I think in fairly recent academic Western philosophy, there's been quite a bit of debate on the existence or non-existence of things like holes. So like a hole in the ground, does it exist? Can you perceive it to exist? And I think that may, at least at the level of perception, I think we can perceive holes, and maybe part of the definition of what a hole is like a missing of something. I think that might be a good example of a perception of an absence. So a thing that's defined by an absence, perceiving the thing as it's defined by its absence. You could argue that what you're really seeing is you're seeing the edges of the hole, and the features around the hole is what you're truly perceiving, and then you're inferring. So the Buddhists would have their argument for why you're not really seeing a hole. But of course the Buddhists could argue you're not really seeing anything. Everything is empty, or some of the more radical philosophers.
Sometimes we infer. Sometimes we infer because there's something missing, like the backside of the giraffe, or the lump of dirt that is now in a mound next to the hole, and we have a kind of a concept in our head, in our mind for hole, and we assign the concept to that patch of land that is missing the top, basically.
Yeah.
Augmented reality is really useful, Terminator vision and whatnot. I wish doctors would be trained to kind of have not literally Terminator vision, but they would look at a patient and they would see their fingers, and the fingers, they would check if they were clubbed or not, if it's a respiratory patient, and they would listen to their cough, and if they cough or not, they would take note, and then see all the other signs, etc. And that would inform where they would apply technology. Basically, they would an ideal doctor, I imagine, does this, even maybe almost subconsciously. Basically, they look at a person, they already see their tone of skin, their posture, how they breathe, how they speak, etc., and they can already make a bit take notes of things to further investigate, if not directly infer some things. Basically,
I look at it, from you were saying, is there such a thing as a hole, or is it just the perception that we see the edges of the mound or whatever, that's created the concave element, that makes the hole. But we're actually just seeing the concave part of the, of that. And could it possibly be that it's like the perception? Whenever you see that duck, that's also the rabbit at the same time. It's a bit of both, depending on which way you look at it. So it's like almost both at the same time. It's like,
another famous example is the vase that are also two faces facing each other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, more like that.
Yeah, we also might experience what we call negative space, and it might even be more salient than the thing in itself that's in the middle. That's the vase, because the vase is white, but the faces come out more to us because they are faces, and our mind is trained literally to recognize faces very fast, and kind of discard things that are not faces.
There's something that Alan Watts said when he was talking about the yin and the yang, and he said that, while there's two sides to the yin and the yang, the light and the dark, and there's the dark within the light and the light within the dark and stuff. But he said that life is not just two distinct dualities, it's not just two distinct states, right? There's one within the other and the other in the opposite side. But what he did was he actually had it on a pinwheel, he said reality is more like this, and he spun the yin yang, and it blurred and became grey. So I actually think the illusion is to think maybe there is these two compartmentalized perceptual states that appear dualistic, but in reality they're one and the same.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about.
Graham, do you have any 50 cents?
I'm just saying, like, in reality, we're only human after all, right? We get tricked by things, our senses can't. It's funny that we're trying to look for this absolute truth behind things. I think either the Buddhists or the Mayans, and it's obvious that our senses get tricked. We perceive things that aren't there. We have distortion in our senses. We can't help it. I mean, to think that anyone is in possession of absolute truth when they view a particular thing, I don't know what they were trying to achieve, or maybe they weren't up to that level where they understood the sciences, that the actual chemical structure of the human brain actually isn't up to that point yet. Where their understanding of it was that we do have that misconception. Like you wrote that crazy word down there before, like they might have had that idea, but they didn't realize it's maybe intrinsically a part of our makeup, our physiology, that we just perceive things wrong. And there's no actual. And I was talking with Plebs about this earlier, before we started this call, and I said something along the lines of what was it? I've lost it now. I think it was just that there's this sort of I've lost it. The thought's gone now. No, I've lost it. Oh, goodbye, thought.
It was related to perception and how.
Oh yeah, that I think that I actually think that we actually accurately perceive things because we're in a group. The collective actually helps us define perception, rather than the individual trying to discern that for themselves. So I think it's a collective pursuit, understanding what is and what isn't, and perception, and that to think the individual has some dominion over that is kind of, ludicrous. So thanks for that, Rogério. You tethered me back. Thanks, man. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I can remember the conversation before we started now too, and then you were talking about how groups often can get into sort of incorrect groupthink, and as a group misperceive things as well.
Yeah,
so I think groups
That's
are in
right.
a similar situation
Totally.
to individuals. They can
Yes.
do both. They can correctly perceive and incorrectly perceive.
like flat earthers.
Yeah, true. Yeah, but I think that the thing is, you have to understand that we're under mass influence. I mean, it's really the superorganism, isn't it? So just one part of that superorganism. It's insane.
Yeah, so coming back to Nyaya, I think they maybe focused more on trying to be quite exact about like when things go right. What does it mean for things to go right? Like, what does it mean for perception? Because they almost want to say if perception didn't go right, or if you're misperceiving something, that they have this word for mistaking one object for another. But I think what it looks to me like their way of thinking is that they could just call it a perception, like you haven't really perceived. Although there could be other ways in which you're not perceiving if you just weren't in contact at all with a thing. But if you're in contact with one thing and you perceive it as something else, that's a misperception, which they have this word for. But they're really saying perception is when you're in contact with the real thing and you're in contact in the correct way. When you get it correctly, then you're perceiving. Otherwise,
this is very human centric. This is very human centric to think that we can perceive accurately in that regard. Because, what about the mantis shrimp? This thing can see in infrared and crazy frequencies and stuff like that, and the light spectrum, and it can just hear sounds that are just beyond us. It's just a complete freak of nature, and we're limited. I think to understand that and kind of go, well, there is a point where we have to draw the line. So maybe actually, we define our world within a group sense. And I think that, the collective helps us see things for the way they are. Because look at it this way. science is built upon the shoulders of giants, isn't it? So without those who came before, we don't have the understanding of the world that we do right now. So it's a collective pursuit, it's a collective endeavor to understand. And I don't know. I don't know whether I also do agree though that the individual needs to sort of figure it out for themselves in that regard. But I think that it's so much influence, especially in today's world with our perceptions. So I don't know how this would apply to current day culture, or the way we perhaps see the world right now as it is.
I have
any thoughts
two
on
examples. I have two examples on this. One is we can also see in infrared and ultraviolet indirectly, of course, through a reproduction, because of the cameras that have been developed and are used by science astronomers.
Again, a collective endeavor.
Again, yeah, exactly. It's a collective endeavor, but also including the technology ingredient. And I think that if we would mention the mantis shrimp to Gautama from Nyaya, he would go to the example of the post versus tree kind of thing, and in which we would say, okay, we are not getting experience or perception from infrared, ultraviolet, etc. And he says, and so withhold your judgment regarding things that only show colors in those spectrum which you cannot perceive. You can only make your judgments yes or no, or A or B, etc. If you actually are attached, if you are connected to those qualities in those objects. You cannot connect to qualities like infrared, ultraviolet, etc. And so you cannot decide for one thing or another, or etc. Thus, enhancing our senses. I think the ancient Nyayas would really think very highly of that we could further enhance our senses, and even if it's indirectly through reproduction, of course, it would still provide more data, more information for the logic, the inference to operate on, even though it's a reproduction.
Can I ask a question then? Right, with the Nyayans probably more directed towards the endeavors of science than the Buddhists, or would there be? Is there a disconnect there? Like
it seems like that, but we don't have clear-cut information as of yet, at least in these episodes, whether the Nyayans were active chemists, astronomers, inventors, etc. So far, it seems like they are basing their tradition on the Vedas, and then they construct all this logical apparatus to navigate debates, and also how to study the world that is perceivable by the senses, by minimizing the mistakes and maximizing the right judgments. And so it seems like it's pre-science, it's ready for science, basically.
I'm with it.
It's like ready for plug and play with science. But so far we have not seen evidence of actually science as we know it.
I see. Well, I think this might have led into that, as you were saying. It might have actually gotten to that point from this sort of philosophy and led there. Yeah.
I think they had maybe slightly different priorities, but that they were influenced by some of the medical literature in classical India, and especially in the episodes on, I think, reasoning, and maybe induction. No, more induction than reasoning. It seems the examples they draw are examples that are much like a physician would to diagnose a patient, the kind of inferences a physician would take. So I don't know if the link there is well established, or if it just looks very plausible that they may have been influenced by some of the medical literature. I think maybe it's just very plausible that they were influenced, rather than well established that they were influenced. And partly also, I think in the first episode we did in the sutra, I think the author of the Nyaya Sutra, I forget his name, Gautama, said that in order to achieve anything, you need true knowledge of how to achieve it. And that plays very nicely in a scientific worldview, where if you want to do successful engineering, you need to understand how things really work. And it's kind of this really tight link between science and technology that we've come to know and love. When people say like science is just another religion, it's like, yeah, well, until the technology works thanks to it, then it becomes not just another worldview. Like when you
and they are tweeting that through a smartphone.
Yeah, listen to this. I'd say unlike any other religion in the world, we actually have practical working models of this science. Unlike religion that has no real practical working model to work. I mean, you can't say, hey, well, here's evidence of God or gods, but you can look at your iPhone and go, yeah, I can text somebody right now. So yeah.
I would also argue that if I would compare science to another collective, so to speak, I would say that science is a philosophy school, and by being a philosophy school, if that is the case, it's the most successful, well-off philosophy school of human history, as far as we know from the history of philosophy, because there are so many practitioners of this philosophy school. Like no other philosophy school before it. The Stoics and Platonists don't even come close in terms of the numbers. But you can also,
the cynic inside me says there's a lot of bad science that gets practiced as well. So it's
there's
there's ups and downs.
There's also bad other traditions being practiced, like people misrepresenting Stoicism even today, bastardizing or strawmanning these traditions, people bastardizing yoga as a thing that's just for people to show off their bodies in gyms. And it's not the case. Well, science at its best is a tradition that came down to us from people like Aristotle, Francis Bacon, Descartes, Karl Popper, other so-called philosophers of science that improved and refined how logic works in science, how the scientific method works, how the peer review system works, etc., how ethics in science works as well. And people, even without knowing, that are scientifically trained, they are using logic, they are using inference and deduction, they are hypothesizing with their creativity as well, and creating experiments, even both physical experiments and thought experiments with creativity, and also using the framework from mathematics to isolate variables, to have results that are statistically relevant, etc. And so they are using tools from philosophy. And so if they're using tools from philosophy, I'm tempted to classify them as another school of philosophy. It's just that they are massively huge and well-successful school of philosophy. We've also
have
seen
a working model.
Yeah, we've also seen people creating things like the steam engine in ancient times, and the Antikythera mechanism, which was really very sophisticated, with bronze gears clock of astronomy and prediction of eclipses and other astronomic phenomena, phases of the moon, etc. And it was created in the Ionian tradition or something like that, which also had people figuring out how the world works and also inventing stuff. So doing engineering as well. And another example is Archimedes, who made also really interesting stuff. He mastered math, probably logic as well, and he invented some stuff. He got his hands dirty. And we have yet to see this in ancient India, I'd say. In Nyaya, in my mind, is more comparable to Platonism in the time of the skeptics, when it's just before the time when we logged off Greece, basically, when skeptics would infuse the academy from Plato after Plato dies, maybe 4th century, generations after Plato. And they completely converted for a while the Platonic Academy into a kind of an academy of science full of skepticism, but still with the source texts of Plato having a kind of a role more or less similar, perhaps, as the Vedas to the Nyayakas. But we see some inventions coming from the ancient Greek world, but we so far haven't talked about this. But anyway, that's probably because this is we're following Peter Adamson, who is doing a history of philosophy podcast and not a history of science and technology podcast. So
Yeah, exactly.
Probably he glances over this stuff. We would need to do our own kind of research on it.
Yeah, exactly. You'd have to do the legwork on that to sort of see what had been laid down at that period. I suppose it's interesting to consider, isn't it? I suppose where these schools of thought and philosophies actually headed and what they actually directly influenced and what. Yeah, it might be outside the scope of Adamson's stuff, but yeah, it's interesting to consider the influence, or just the influence of this sort of stuff, because obviously, if the Nyayians are there going, let's unravel the true nature of reality and see for what it really well and truly is, as much as we can possibly perceive it, and take into account all avenues, which seems to sort of be, I mean, they even see this thing, the conceptual perception, like this sort of thing, that there is concepts behind perception rather than it just sort of be the Buddhist. In my understanding, if I have this right, is that like, that I think, what was it, that there's the conceptual is illusionary or something, wasn't that the thing with Buddhism, like that you shouldn't have it should just be the moment, the raw moment, and no concepts preceding what you see, and it should just be what it is. It sort of leaves, I mean, then it really would mean then that there is no experiential evidence to support anything you see, that your perceptions wouldn't be based in your memory. It would just be complete naked perception with no guidance from experience. So am I understanding that right? Is it the difference between the Nyayians and the Buddhists? I don't understand this obsession they have with the moment then. If Buddhists really are like that, then they're missing out on a lot of stuff. I don't know if I'm hearing that right.
Well, at least for this position, it seems like that. This position of some of these Buddhists, of this sampling of Buddhists that Adamson mentions, are saying that everything is an illusion except for the raw experience, without any concepts added to it. And they go further to saying that a chariot is just the sum of its pieces. Buddhists can you even just gestalt? They cannot. It's all just a pile, skandhas, and they, even though Buddhists seem to have this idea of cause and effect and everything connected, pratika samupada, there's a lot of nuance in scholars like Buddhadasa Bhikkhu, who goes back to primordial Buddhism, and he kind of complains that there's a lot of stuff added in Buddhist metaphysics that really it's just a deviation of stuff that really has merit and value. And so there's also internal criticism inside Buddhism as well. And I'd say that absolutist positions, like saying, "Oh, you should just live purely in the moment at all times, and don't think about your perceptions. Don't add to your perceptions in any way, however meaningful or however joy enhancing it could be. Don't do that. Just perceive the thing like a baby seeing everything for the first time." Although sometimes this might come in handy. Sometimes I think going all in is maybe a waste. I'd say only Siths deal in absolutes.
Yeah, heralding back to what Nerdalliun said.
Sorry, if we can we maybe just give Graham a
I don't think he can talk on mic.
Well,
I think he's having mic.
He was having some trouble.
Can you guys hear me now?
Oh no, I hear you now. Yeah.
No, that's why I dropped and came back. Yeah, no, getting back to this one, I wanted to comment on that whole idea of perceiving absence, because part of the idea that I get from it is there's an action involved in that, there's an implied action involved behind that perception, because you can't perceive something until it exists. So what you're perceiving is, instead of a whole, is a removal. And it's basically a concept of, it's the idea of, you've constructed a frame, a model of reality that allows for the addition or the removal of something. And that's a higher level construct, because that's part of, I try to simplify terminology into my own, and I kind of take perception as the base level, and it's basically, that can't be wrong because that's your raw inputs. It's the interpretations, and I think what they're talking about more of that true perception is more of an accurate conception, where they're able to get the idea that they're able to extract from it accurately corresponds to reality. And this has to go with, they're touching on the whole map territory relationship, which in Latin, that's the whole imago, which is image of God sort of concept. And it's the idea that perception and conception form a feedback loop. It's like the raw data flows up to the conceptual level. And at that point, you start working with it with yourself, getting ideas, words, definitions. And they have definitions are what connects that fundamental perceptions with the realm of words and ideas. And that's why definitions are so important for them. It connects the undefinable to the words and such. And once you have that conceptual level, now you get a feedback loop. The perception feeds up into there, you conceptualize it, but once you start conceptualizing, you get expectations of what your perceptions are going to be. And those perceptions are more of that Terminator view that's laid over top of the fundamental raw perception underneath. And that's sort of what we're working with there. And I tend to take it as what we perceive is actually correct. We don't perceive everything there is to perceive, and we filter it through our framings. And I now know what I need to get Nerdalliun for Christmas, and that I need to get him a book that's 101 Uses for a Buddhist. I think he needs that book. Tag.
Yeah, they make lovely decorations, staked like Vlad the Impaler on Pong.
I was just going to say something. I've got an insight. I've got to say it before I forget. So the thing is, look at the human body. We are wired to feel in deficit. When we don't have nutrients, we don't have a supply of food, right? We feel an emptiness inside our guts, right? Instinctually, we need to hunt, we need to devour, we need to consume, we destroy in order to live, right? And the whole concept of the idea of even having a glass, a vessel, even the ones that we possess in human form, it grows empty. We need to replenish that supply. So I think there might be some physiological kind of almost way to look at the way we perceive emptiness to begin with, is that we're constantly needing to leach off the nutrients of everything around us to survive. So the idea of emptiness and absence is already an inherent characteristic within the human form. So
that's a very long story to explain physiologically, actually. Our body has homeostasis, which is a word that does a lot of heavy work. It means that our body is filled with a bunch of sensors all over the place that detect things like glucose levels. And if glucose starts to lower beyond a certain threshold, and they detect these thresholds and amplify signals from when the threshold is reached into what we call action potentials when nerves are involved, for instance, or situations of cell signaling, where a single molecule that is the first signal is just one, and it touches a receptor, and the receptor produces 100 and then 10,000 and millions, and then the signal is strong enough for the nerves to sense and other structures of the body to make what was initially just the glucose lowering to like 70 milligrams per deciliter into one thing that starts to give an impression in the brain of hunger, and the person starts seeking food. So there's a lot of machinery at work and in sync to make things happen so that we don't die of neglecting eating, basically, or something like that.
See, my general point though is that, that's our central kind of, that's the one we could relate to absence in itself is that feeling, which is, and we look at a whole, we look at a vessel, we look at something that's perceivably empty, but that is within us. That's all I'm trying to say, is that like it's a natural state of being, So I think absence is perceived because we feel it every day. We get hungry, So it's like obvious that we're going to perceive that because it's a natural state. We're always in deficit. We're not always in deficit, but we feel periods of deficit.
But look at what happens in this example that I gave. There's a sensor somewhere in the body, in cells or whatnot. I'm not going to name names, because I also don't remember the particulars. But probably this is very likely physiologically. There's a sensor that senses oxygen, and if the oxygen level drops below a certain threshold, it signals for the lungs to hyperventilate, or there's another sensor that senses the excess of carbon dioxide also in the blood, and also prompts the body to hyperventilate, the diaphragm and other respiratory muscles to hyperventilate. Also, there's a sensor that's constantly being stimulated by glucose, and when the rate of stimulus decreases, it means that the level has decreased to dangerous levels, almost dangerous levels, or nearing the dangerous levels that would spell doom for the brain, which is and other nerves, which depends very, very much on glucose. And thus the absence of one thing is actually it equates to lower rate of stimuli, and this lower rate of stimuli might initiate a cascade that is, instead of negative space, like a lower rate, it equates to an amplifying signal that is kind of positive space. And so in this example of physiology, we have a raw experience, so to speak, that directly translates to something also non-conceptual, that is a positive effect, basically. While when we look at a patch of land, a patch of dirt, and it has no hole, then we just see it as default and nothing special happens in our perception. But when we see a hole, and holes are potentially dangerous because people can trip on them or fall in them, and so evolutionarily it makes sense for our minds and our brains to develop in a way that quickly identifies stuff that is potentially dangerous, like open wells and holes that rabbits have dug that we might trip in, and
instincts,
whatnot. Yeah, exactly. And so I think it means that we have a conception of a flat land for us to walk on, proper walking ground, and if there is a hole there, then it violates our expectations, so to speak, our kind of innate evolutionary psychology expectations of properly walking ground, and our kind of Terminator vision, so to speak, puts a red flag onto the hole.
Yep.
And we warn ourselves by reminding ourselves there's a hole, I won't put, so I don't put my foot in it. And yesterday when I was doing a nature walk, we saw for a couple of times holes, like wells, holes that seemed dug by rabbits or moles, and we were warning everyone, there's a hole to your left, there's a hole to your right, and stuff like that. And I think in our mind we also do this kind of exercise.
I'm gonna have to step in and speak up for my avatar here, Mandelbrot, where their holes come in all varying sizes. It depends on what scale of perception you're trying to filter it at. Because what looks like it's like when you look through a microscope, like the ant-sized view. Things are totally different there. He doesn't, that view doesn't perceive it, and that's where you're getting into psychological framing, and it's what you're talking about with what's important to us falling. So we're tuning this what we call a whole and what we call something based off of that one, but it's basically arbitrary based off of our psychological frame rather than anything inherent in reality. I mean, it's inherent in reality. We're refracting it, as we've talked about. Does that make sense, guys? Tag?
It makes sense, but I think that when we see a small hole that we could put our foot in and trip, or a big hole like a well, an open well, that doesn't have any covering, not any wall, as we've seen yesterday in our nature walk, we compare the size of the hole to the size of our body inherently, and I think
sounds like it's relative.
Yeah, I think it's relative, like the Vitruvian Man. We compare stuff with the size of the human body, which is us, and we see, okay, I could completely fall into the well. It's bigger than I am, and I couldn't even have a chance. While the rabbit hole, I could at worst, just plunge my foot in it and trip. So very, very different in terms of danger scale and classification between these two examples, I'd say.
Kind of throws a wrench in the as it is above it is below kind of attitude. It sort of defies that a little bit. The idea that actually as it is below, it's a lot different than it is above, in the microcosm to the macrocosm. And,
that one's invoking the man is the measure. That one's invoking man as the measure of all things principle.
Well, yes, but for means of survival, I won't kind of look at my son who was with me and say, well, this hole that's kind of dangerous for me because I could trip in it, he could kind of fit more in it than I would, and so I would kind of empathize that I couldn't universalize the threat level for me of a hole to every single other person who has different sizes. But I think every single person for themselves will look at the hole and kind of look at themselves, so to speak, and compare their size with the size of the hole.
Can I just quickly check my mic levels here? Is that a lot better?
You sound okay.
Okay, cool. Just checking.
Yeah,
does he sound okay to you too, Nerdalliun?
Sorry?
Does Wolfie sound well for you too? Because I didn't notice any loudness at all.
Yeah, it's better now. Thanks.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
I wanted to maybe this sort of man as measure of all things idea or relativism idea, but maybe harken back to some of the discussion we had earlier in this study group series about the nature of metaphysics, and especially ontology, and making assumptions about the basic things that exist. And so with the case here of the Nyayakas and the Buddhists, they're operating from different metaphysics where they have different assumptions about the basic things reality is made up of. And the Buddhists are basically saying, here's one set of basic things, and you think you are seeing something like a wheelbarrow, but really you're not. That's made up of more basic things, and you're inferring the existence of a wheelbarrow based on your experience of the basic constituents of reality. And the Nyayakas have like a different idea of the basic things that exist, and because they take perception as a source of knowledge, they just refer to the fact that they perceive some objects as evident enough proof that those exist, so they kind of just shut down Buddhists with their skeptical arguments right off the bat. They basically say, I can perceive a giraffe, therefore giraffes exist. Like lots of people have perceived giraffes. They exist. And just as a slight tangent, I wanted to touch on something Wolfie brought up about like figuring stuff out being a social or a group activity. The Nyayakas did list testimony as one of their sources of knowledge, so they definitely, I think, take the input of other people and what other people say seriously as a source of knowledge and build on top of each other, and have a very rich tradition of commentaries on commentaries on commentaries on commentaries, so they definitely are doing this kind of social thing.
Well, the fundamental building blocks of culture, pretty much, isn't it?
Yeah. But so, something I think it's important to watch out for is to realize that different metaphysical systems can have their uses and their limitations, and which one is the appropriate one or the better one in any given situation depends on context and circumstance, and also on people's goals and values. And so for some goals, I think Nyaya could be more useful, and for different goals, maybe Buddhism is more valuable in terms of their assumptions of the basic things that exist. And in that sense, I sort of tend to agree with Heraclitus in man being the measure of all things.
It's actually Gorgias, I think.
Gorgias?
Gorgias, the sophists.
Protagoras.
Protagoras, yeah, one of these.
Yeah, not Heraclitus. It was definitely not Heraclitus. Either Gorgias or Protagoras or something. Yeah, sorry, mistaken there. But yeah, so not in the sense that in the more radically revisionist sense of, say, the Vedanta school. So I think the Vedantas and some other schools too, there's just an example. So Parmenides and the Eleatics were similar to this. They basically say, everything we perceive is entirely illusory. So we have a vastly incorrect perception of true reality, and we can get to know true reality by means other than perception. Perception is not to be trusted. So in the case of the Eleatics, they had logic that would take them to the reality, and I think in the case of Vedanta, they had the authority of holy scriptures in the Vedas to get them to reality, and entirely mistrust of perception. I think that's too radical, and like even when I say things are like relatively true, I don't I don't mean in a sort of radically skeptical kind of way. I just think you could start with the basic ideas of Buddhism and put that to good use and make some good sense of some aspects of life and come to wise insights about life. And you can start with the basic assumptions of the Nyayakas, which are at odds with the Buddhists, as we see with them like having lots of debates with the Buddhists. And you could also come to some real wise insights about the nature of reality. And for that matter, you could start with the assumptions of Vedanta and come to some Protagoras. There you go.
Yeah, just a flashback from the past, a blast from the past.
So you could start with different assumptions, and you could reach insightful and wise places. And also, like any of those assumptions, you could reach some very foolish places if you're not careful. So I think something that needs to be avoided is a kind of vanity and parochialism of deciding one of these groups has the final answer, and we can safely either just ignore or outright mock and disdain other groups and other metaphysical systems and just stick to the one. So that's the one, like the one version of it, and sometimes another version of it is a sort of denial of any diversity, saying that basically all metaphysical systems come down to saying the same thing, and because my favorite metaphysics system is the best at saying that one thing, I can safely ignore others, because like whatever they say that's correct, it just amounts to the same things that my school says anyway. I think both of those are very dangerous for similar reasons that, you know, the building blocks of culture is sort of learning from each other, and I think there's a lot to gain in terms of richness in life and wisdom and fulfillment. I don't think life has to be this thing that's just a constant feeling of lack and emptiness and sort of want for something that's not there. I think it's possible for human beings maybe not to achieve nirvana and liberation. I think some of these spiritual teachers maybe oversell the position, but I do think people can achieve a fair amount of fulfillment and satisfaction that's maybe not devoid of any suffering ever again in any time in the future. But I think that's significantly more fulfilled and relatively a much better position than, say, some of the more severe feelings of nihilistic depression where everything just feels not enough and empty and meaningless and completely unsatisfactory. I think it's possible for humans to be in a different state of being where life doesn't feel empty and meaningless, but life feels meaningful and rich and full of meaning and full of joy and full of richness. And I think part of the way I've been enriching my life is by taking traditions that are very different from the tradition I was raised in. I was raised in one of the many strands of Protestant Christianity, of which there really is a fantastic diversity, because they're a very disagreeable bunch, and they like to start their own little churches over tiny little differences. But yeah, so the Nyayakas is a very foreign philosophical system to me, as is Vedanta, as is Buddhism, as is like a lot of the Greek stuff, and we're going to get to Islam, and we're going to get to Africa, and we're going to get to medieval Europe, and like lots of these people have ideas that are just very foreign, but I think they're all worth learning about, even if we end up disagreeing with much of what they said. They're perfectly content, apparently, to disagree among each other also. I think just the conversation itself is quite enriching, and like keeping busy learning about this stuff is something that adds richness and meaning to my life. So yeah, this kind of group activity of people just getting together and trying to figure things out and trying to understand what other people mean. Wise people in the past who, just because they were wise doesn't mean they were infallible or 100% correct about everything they said, but they had interesting things to say. It's possible to be very interesting or incorrect in very interesting ways, which I think a lot of these people is a category a lot of them fall into. Sometimes we learn lessons that we can actually apply in our lives as well from these people. I think that's that little rant over. I'll hang out on that.
Nerdalliun, I'll just sum it up and say, like, the thing that humanity, the trick that we need to learn is to actually understand and learn from history. That would be a really good thing if we could just fathom the wisdom of the past and probably critique it, understand, and open debate about what that's about. The pros and the cons of different ways of thinking. Just understanding that. I think there's never been a time in history where academic thinking or intellectualism has been more shunned than today. And I think that's wrong. I think that a lot of people seem to lurch away from the investigations of the mind. And I think, cynically, I would say that maybe we're doomed. But I hope not. I hope that, what we represent and what we're doing here, I think hopefully might impact or change subtly possible directions that people could take, maybe make them think differently about these ways of thinking, these schools of thought, maybe embracing difference, embracing the novel, and playing that game of the mind, the figuring things out for themselves, is really what it's all about. And what's this other thing you said? I hate to say it, but I take a leaf out of Dionysus's book. I think celebration, feasting, partying, it has its place, and not to the point of excess, but to celebrate even the fruits of one's intellectual endeavor, and to treat that like a celebration in itself is a good thing. And not just the drinking and the feasting and everything, but to actually look at what we're doing here as a celebration of the fact that we're humans and that we're active in our communities. We're actually trying to search for change. We're searching for the answers. We're seekers, and that in itself is an admirable quality to possess. And I could only wish that more people could understand that that's a virtuous characteristic amongst people.
I would say that Giordano Bruno would argue with you that his time was worse for academic pursuits and freedom. When he was burned at the stake for the heliocentric, adopting this heliocentric system, standing up to the church. Yeah. Unfortunately, when he was getting burned at the stake, he couldn't argue with you because they'd already torn his tongue out.
Well, let's just hope that today's world doesn't regress to such barbarism. Eventually.
Or the Burma of Pol Pot, where they would laser focus on eliminating the intelligentsia of the country. They wanted to go back to simple serfs and just an overruling elite, basically. Yeah, go ahead, Graham. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I also wanted to address the Nerdalliun's point about that sticking to one school and, ridiculing and mocking any other school. I think he sells that short as far as the political power behind it, because that's really used a lot in order to justify like war and slaughtering the other people who have adapted the wrong school. So without that, you're losing a lot of political power for your leaders. Tagging on that.
But you always need someone to blame, don't you? If you're a real politician.
I would also like to call your attention to the importance of moving on to the next subject as well. And to build on what you just said, Nerdalliun, really very quickly. We've seen this in action of people traveling through different traditions with the Ionians, and probably the greatness of the philosophy in ancient Greece would not have been so if Hecataeus, Herodotus, Plato, even Pythagoras had not traveled and learned from others like the Egyptians, Babylonians, and who knows who else, and then returned to Greece with these learnings and founded their own schools and started teaching pieces of timeless wisdom, basically. And another thing that I've noticed by contrasting the culture in which I live in, and also the culture in which I was grown up in contrast with different cultures from different periods of time in different parts of the world, is what they have that we do not have in our time. Basically highlights the holes that we have. So again, to go back to the holes, these holes, like having a healthy relationship with mortality, is a gaping hole in our cultures, because people only think about these things when someone dies or they themselves are about to die. But other than that, they don't. They try to sweep it under the rug and not think about their own mortality. But these ancient traditions, they had to, by necessity, get some way to deal with the concepts of mortality and other concepts as well, like impermanence, the fragility of human life, and also the proneness of the human mind to panic and accumulate stress. These problems have been tackled and addressed by many traditions for millennia, and even though they might not have come with perfect answers, they have kind of like half-baked work in progress answers that survive to our days, that we can pick up and polish and add to it, thanks to our scientific learning. And so there is a lot of value to be produced, and part of this value is actually personal meaning to us. But not only that, we can also become in a position that we can also share what we've learned with others and the stuff that we've been putting together with others. So it's a really worthwhile endeavor. Okay, so
but you're just next, like,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Go to the next thing. I'll shut that down.
Okay. Take note, because we will discuss after this segment as well. Okay. Never underestimate your capacity to forget stuff, even stuff that's really interesting and important. Write it down, because I also forget stuff. If I don't write down a question, like can we perceive absence without conception or something like that, I will probably forget it, because there's so much ideas going ahead here. It's like a Niagara Falls of ideas. Okay, so Nyaya on reasoning, especially inference. And so when it comes to perception, sometimes we need to use inference, like when we see only the half side of the moon and we don't see the rest. So to see the entirety of the moon and map the entirety of the moon, we need more than just perceptions. We can also intuit that the other side of the moon is as cratered as the front side, and kind of imagine it without using any probes or satellites or whatnot. So we could infer without all that technology that the backside of the moon is pretty much the same as the front side, and we would be more or less correct in that assertion. It's not radically different. So we need more than just perceptions to get through life. Like, for instance, when we see the front side of a car, we can be pretty sure that there is a backside as well of the car. Although probably the front side is turned to us and it's the part that can hit us. So Nyaya has also figured out that besides perception, we also need reason, of which inference, or anumana as they call it, is an essential component. So anumana literally translated means that which follows after perception. And then there's this example that in podcast terms, it wasn't so vivid, but well, slides have this way of turning things more nice, more vivid, raising the stakes. What if you are an ancient Indian walking through a forest? You hear a distinctive low growling sound, and mistakenly this sort of sound made by a tiger. So you run like hell. Do you run from the tiger or from the inferred tiger from the sound? So if you didn't see the tiger but only heard the growl, you run from something that you have inferred or imagined. So basically, some of these questions that were popping up before, yes, there's a place for imagination in Nyaya, and the imagination can be wild. We can just imagine random things, or we can conduct or structure our imagination to actually help us navigate the world. And this example of the tiger, it could be someone playing a prank on us and mimicking the tiger's growl, and we would still be right to run from it because the prank is a low probability occurrence compared to it being an actual tiger growling, I would say. And so it's better to be safe than to be dead, basically. Better to err on safety. And so the flow would be perception of tiger-like sounds, inference that the tiger is present, and run like hell. Not from the sound, but from the unseen tiger, a hypothetical tiger. So this anumana, this inference, allows us to go beyond what is directly perceived to that which we cannot perceive. So basically, the world conveys perceptions to us. But the world holds more than just the perceptions that it conveys to us. There is an entire spectrum of light that we do not see. There are many wavelengths of sound that are going throughout the atmosphere, the air, that we cannot hear because our human ear is not adequate to it. We have walls in front of us, occluding stuff that is going on in other parts, in other rooms of our apartment, or in other rooms of the building, in other apartments. And also, thankfully, we cannot see through walls as well. But we must also assume that even though we are not seeing other stuff going on outside of our house, we should not assume, like a baby, that the entire world disappears and nothing goes on. So it's useful to use inference as a kind of an engine of generating our hypothetical and plausible manifestation of the world through either direct experience to complement it, or even through memory, because we remember that outside of our building, there's a highway, and there are always cars and trucks and motorcycles barreling through. It won't just automatically go desertic or silent. So the examples given were of that tiger, but another could be an illness. So these two examples are different, and they are different for interesting reasons. The tiger is actually perceivable, even though he might be occluded due to the vegetation. So the tiger is an actual thing that we can see, if not for the barrier or the thing that is interfering with our sight. As for diseases, probably we cannot see that lack of beta cells in the pancreas that causes diabetes in someone, or we cannot see the microorganism that causes pneumonia in someone coughing with phlegm. But through the symptoms, we can infer that the person has something wrong with them, and if we are properly instructed and trained and did our due diligence in acquiring medical knowledge, then we can have a shot at nailing down the actual diagnosis. If not, just to send the person or recommend them to go to a doctor, so things can be done officially, basically. And then the favorite example of the Niayas, well, this is my town. It had a forest fire just before we started speaking about Niayas, and the Niayakas love this example. So smoke coming from the other side of a hill. Can we confidently say that because we see smoke, there are flames of fire in the other side of the mountain? And yeah, they use this as the ex libris example of inference. The mountain has fire because it has smoke. Then, well, philosophers who have mastered Latin might say that smoke is a probans, that which offers proof, while Niaicus would call the smoke a hetu, or linga, which means a mark or a sign. So kind of an adequate term, considering its role in the inference workflow. The Niaicus would call paxa the mountain where the smoke is observed. So the object on which something we will want to infer something, or the bush from which disconcerting growl emanates. While the fire is the probandum, that which is proven without direct experience of it. The Niaicus termed sadhya or sadhya dharma, the fire, the thing whose presence we infer from the sign in that object. So also applicable to the supposed tiger. And then we have one thing that's also very typical of the Niaicas, the example. So the fire in the kitchen, it's termed the drishtanta, a term that I think you might remember from last session. So an example, that a valid example in which there is an association between the linga and the sadhya, basically. So our inferences should be supported by naming a valid example where a similar sign revealed the presence of a similar signified thing. Also, in the case, in the case of the cough, I also already mentioned it, so it's no reason to repeat that. When we experience a cough, we recommend someone to see the doctor. So what do inferences need to be unimpeachable sources of knowledge? So any inference would, just any inference we could randomly come up with probably would not necessarily fit the bill. So they need a dependable sign. And there are three kinds of signs. A proof of what? which is based on what is prior. These signs, these three signs, have different interpretations according to the commenters of the Nyayas. So, for instance, it will rain because of the large black cloud. And so we see a cause that has been associated with the effect in our experience. And so we use it as an inference. There's the Sesavat based on a remainder. So interpretation one would be, it has been raining because the river is swollen. So we see also instead of seeing the cause, we see the effect, and so we infer the cause from the effect. Then there is the Samanya Todorsta, which is observation of a generality. So the sun must be moving at the moment, even though it doesn't look like it, because over a longer period of time it is observed to change position. The commentary of Gautama Vatsyayana was uncertain, so he offered alternate interpretations. So Gautama means reasoning from cause to effect. So from effect to cause, and from a generalization to a particular case. The other potential interpretation was Gautama means all sorts of causal inference. So all sorts of inference canvassed in previous interpretation. Reasoning by process of elimination. So envision an exhaustive range of possibilities and then eliminate all but one. Kind of like Sherlock Holmes would say, Arthur Conan Doyle, actually, in the words of Sherlock Holmes, would say, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Then we can also assign a property to something because of the class of things to which it belongs. Then this commenter Vatsyayana would say, mental states are qualities. Qualities have subjects. Therefore, there is a subject of mental states, namely the self, and thus he shuts up the Buddhists. While Gautama would say, there are two kinds of example that can serve to motivate an inference. One is positive examples, which turn on similarity, so they function by analogy, like smoke implies fire. And then there are negative examples, where we allude to a situation where the sign is absent, and the thing signified is also absent. So if they always come together, and they also go together. If they're absent together, then when we see one absent, then the other one could be inferred to be absent as well. So basically, we could argue here by this analogy also. Like over lake water, we have never encountered neither smoke nor fire. And so when we see a lake, we can be sure if we are swimming on it or paddling through, we are safe from fire, and the lake won't catch fire, basically. And it won't also emit smoke. Then, well, the above reasoning, it's kind of probably not static. Likely in reasoning and in debates, they would go back and forth between positive and negative examples, which could reinforce each other, and they could even narrow down what is possible and what is not possible inference-wise. And well, no appeal is made to any law of nature or universal rule. This is entirely case-based reasoning. So case-based reasoning has its limitations, of course, especially when we want to go to the fringes of science and we want to describe anomalies and stuff that doesn't usually happen. Probably using case-based reasoning on stuff that is usually happens, it probably won't pan out really well. But for everyday things, for us to get to work on time and without any accidents and whatnot, case-based reasoning probably is the really valuable tool, because when we see that the stoplights going red, we can be sure that probably there will be cars coming from the cross direction from the road, and if we try to cross, we will get hit. It's a fair inference to make that actually helps us, even if done subconsciously. It helps us to stay alive and arrive at work. Then there are 3 examples from the Nyayikas that are in the Nyaya Sutra by Gautama. So seeing ants carrying their eggs all frantically, one can infer that it will rain. So really interesting critters these that do these different behaviors before it rains. Or seeing a full and swiftly flowing river, one infers that it has been raining. Or seeing smoke, one can infer the presence of unseen fire. Also, it's important to emphasize to delve deeper and try to understand why certain signs are regularly linked to certain things. For instance, we might be mystified by how ants are able to predict the weather in advance. So maybe they have some weather channel or something like that in their little tiny ant hills or something like that. Other examples. So the rice in the pan reasoning that can manifest in the example of you stick your finger in the sea and taste your finger like a drop of sea, and it tastes salty. Thus, you can infer and extrapolate to the entirety of the sea that it's all salty, or by tasting 1 grain of rice from the pot, and the grain of rice is cooked, and then you infer that the entirety of the rice is cooked. In my experience, it usually pans out quite well, but occasionally I have tasted cooked rice because it wasn't properly stirred. Some of the rice might be cooked and not the other, so it's really important to stir the rice so that we can apply the rice in the pan reasoning, and it actually works. So case-based reasoning might reliably lead us through life, while spectacularly minimizing wasteful use of resources. So all that Cartesian logic crunching of everything that strikes our senses would probably spell our doom in no time. But if we kind of structure our approach to everyday problems by kind of fashioning rails for our logic, and just go with the rails and discard stuff that's outside of the rails for the most part, we will be fine and dandy in our lives. It's only when something different occurs that we need to kind of invest energetically more in our awareness, in our logical and rational abilities to figure out what the heck is going on, so that we can return to normalcy or something like that. Then there's these concepts of fallacies as well. So hetva basa, fallacy. It literally means something that has merely the appearance of being a sign. And then there's the word jati, merely apparent communality between an example and the locus. So an argument based on a false resemblance, it suffers from this fallacy. Well, Probably Gautama is interested in describing fallacies because the Nyayikas frequently engaged in debates. So identifying a fallacy among the adversaries would be a really surefire way to win a debate. Also, the dependability of scientific prediction and medical prognosis. This kind of avoiding fallacies would yield probably good diagnoses and also good astronomical predictions. Also, working out how arguments can go bad also indirectly informs us of what a sound argument is. There are 5 types of fallacy according to Gautama. So there's the Savyabhikara, which is a deviating fallacy. A deviating fallacy is a sign that is present, but the inferred property is not. So something like an example by Vatsyayana, sound is eternal because it is intangible. But then he criticizes this point by saying, but there are other things like pain that are also intangible, but thankfully not eternal. So the dependable sign, it must not deviate from the property inferred from the sign. Gautama would add, it is not enough to provide an analogy. There needs to be a universal rule, which is a vyapti. I'll share it here as well. So vyapti, connecting sign with signified. Then there is viruddha, which is the incoherent. So a conclusion of an argument should not contradict other well-established positions or beliefs. For instance, a fire, the position that someone could make. Fire is cold because it is a substance and all substances are cold. So maybe something that kids who have never touched fire might perhaps hypothesize before they touch fire for the first time. Since all substances other than fire are not hot, fire by then empirical experimentation by the new human, they will figure out that fire is the exception to the general rule. And so there needs to be a new rule created so that everything that is associated with fire can be classified as hot without there being a contradiction or a nullification of the other rule that all other things now except fire are cold or are not hot at least. Then for the indecisive, the prakara sanama, if 2 equally strong arguments lead to opposite conclusions, we must reserve judgment. So it's kind of like the example of the post in the distance, seemingly might be a human being, though it's kind of difficult to tell them apart or to make the judgment. So although we kind of might have hopes here for Gautama to support skepticism, Gautama actually doesn't. Because he assumes that this problem will arise only occasionally and not be pervasive in philosophical argumentations. Maybe because this problem is kind of dependable on something interfering with these senses, which can be arguably corrected by, for instance, the person approaching the so-called object that might be a post or a human and identifying them beyond a doubt. Then there is sadhyasama, same predicament. So same predicament is a sign that is not distinguished from what is signified is said to have the same predicament. because it itself needs to be proved. An example: a shadow is a substance because it moves. However, this is a faulty line of reasoning, because the shadow has not been proved to move as well. Then, last but not least, there is kala theta, which is mistimed. Well, the meaning here is obscured. Apparently, merely formulating a fallacious thesis would be enough to show it cannot be true. Sometimes they are obvious. Otherwise, reasons in support is offering reasons in support of a position that is blatantly fallacious is pointless, a waste of time. So maybe Gautama might have meant mistimed in that sense. Later, Nyayikas tried to also took a stab at interpreting this obscure part of the sutra, and they posit that it might have been cases where an unintended conclusion has already been shown to be false by some other means. So, like a thesis that is just obviously false. For instance, there is a vegetarian tiger in the bush. So some things in debates won't even be taken seriously by how blatantly ridiculous even or nonsense they are. And to mark our finish, I have here a slide which shows a bunch of women from the sutra period, hypothetically. Because we have only been listening to men speak, and now we've signified our end here in the Nyaya logic and also perception. So feel free, guys, to add to what I've just said, and enough for the slides. If you guys want me to go back to the slides, I can go as well. These literally were girls that were created when I was literally writing. I want a man, a male, a sage, and still the AI was sometimes depicting women. So, well, there's where I have put the unintended product of AI to use. You need to unmute yourself, Nerdalliun.
Sorry, thanks. Apparently the OpenAI's DALL-E 3 solves this problem that apparently both Midjourney and Stable Diffusion product have, that they kind of take some liberties depending on your prompt and leave things out that you included, and sometimes include things that you didn't include in the prompt. So I think DALL-E 3 is promising to stick much closer to the thing you actually asked for. So,
do you mean negative prompts, perhaps?
I think they just improved the model, the way the model parses prompts. So okay. It's a new model. I think it reads better, and it translates what it reads into images more faithfully. At least that's the advertisements. It's fairly new. I don't know even if it's released to the public yet, so you could play with. But maybe soon enough, the damn AI will stop giving you women when you ask for men, or adding things that for bizarre reasons, and leaving things that you very specifically want them to include out. Anyway.
Yeah, literally, I say men in the positive prompt, and I put women, girls, etc. in the negative prompt, and still it produces women.
Very keen on producing women.
Yeah.
I think it could be quite fun to speculate on potential meanings of mistimed, especially if we remember that this was a very dialectical notion of reasoning and debate, kala theta. And so, like, whatever the reasons given would be unfolding in an interaction. So I think maybe someone could say something true or argue something true, but it hasn't yet, like the prerequisite steps in a grander argument haven't yet been established, or it takes for granted things that, you know, like the argument may take for granted things that haven't been established in the conversation yet, and for that reason fails, even though they may be true. It may be faulty reasoning. You should start from the start and then work your way up to the conclusions, and not leave steps out. I think that's often a complaint in, say, mathematical proofs, where there are big assumptions made, or the reader is instructed in the textbook, like the proof of this, or the proof of this statement in this part of the proof is left as an exercise to the reader. It's not necessarily a mistake in that context, but it could be a form of bad reasoning, where it, like another potential, I'm wildly speculating, as I said. I think it's a fun thing to think about, like how timing could be a form of poor reasoning, even if it's not necessarily incorrect reasoning. Like timing, when talking to other people in a persuasive manner, someone may not be ready to hear a particular message. So you may be able to persuade them or to convince them of some truths that they then need to think over and to make their own and to make peace with. And this could be because you've already contradicted some of the things in their worldview, and they haven't yet internalized a new worldview that's updated those things. And so they still have in their mind an outdated worldview that's going to make appreciating what you're saying now quite difficult. So like giving people some time to internalize step by step these things could improve the quality of a conversation. Or maybe mistimed in the sense that you're making an argument that's irrelevant to the purposes at hand. So it's out of place almost in the nature of discussion. You're arguing towards a purpose that nobody shares with you, or even arguing something counter purposes. I don't know. So those are some extra thoughts. I know that's different from the commenters on the Basha, but they apparently aren't entirely sure what the hell Gautama meant.
I also want to share my go-to interpretation, even before I read what the commenters would interpret, which is that kind of thing that happens when someone throws an insult at you, and you have nothing to say, and probably you say something lame or something like that, and the next day you have the perfect response, but it's the next day. It's no longer time for that. So that was one possibility, but it could equate to in a logical, in a debate, basically, when the subject has moved on and you have a really nice criticism to a position held in a subject that was discussed 3 or 4 or 5 subjects ago. And so because of everyone just being focused on or hyper focused on something way forward in the sequence of subjects or whatnot, people will tend to reject you for going against the grain, so to speak, in the flow of conversation. But it's also quite plausible, trying to draw an example from your hypothetical interpretation, kind of like everyone in Europe believes the geocentric model. Everyone believes the Earth is in the center. Then Copernicus, Kepler, Tycho Brahe and whatnot, they do observations and recordings and mathematical calculations and a lot of work. Galileo as well, but Copernicus was already on that. And so even though literally everyone is geocentric, he mathematically demonstrated for his own criteria, high standards of criteria in mathematics. The heliocentric model fits the data much more nicely without the need for so much corrections and whatnot. All these epicycles and whatnot that people needed to do in the geocentric model. However, if Copernicus would just go out and present his model and his conclusions to the authorities in that day, probably it wouldn't be timely. People wouldn't be receptive to it, and they would need to kind of be introduced to different steps of the process, little by little, until they integrate them, little by little, until they themselves are kind of either ready for the heliocentric model, because the geocentric model now seems lame and kind of inefficient in comparison to the thing that is presenting itself, and then the heliocentric model can be presented officially. It's now ready. The time has come. It's an idea for which the time has come, so to speak. So maybe this interpretation has some sense, and it might work in debates, even in a kind of a microcosm of time, not necessarily decades or centuries in like the history of a continent.
You want to chime in, Graham?
Can you chime in?
Yeah, I can give it a shot. Yeah, no. What I was going on for before, some of what you're talking about there hit onto my Giordano Bruno example, but it's the getting back to way early in the conversation. I see it more of a processing of a potential. It's like they're not running from either the tiger it's like they're running from a potential harm. And what's changing when you hear that noise is your judgment of potential harm has changed, and you're making your judgment off of the potential harm as opposed to whether or not it's a specific tiger or not a tiger or anything like that. And the other one that I wanted to say is with the dark side of the moon. Again, since we've never seen it, some ideas are more exciting and, fun than others. I rather like the idea of it's, filled with, alien cities filled with UFOs flying around. Yeah, probably not true given what I've seen of the pictures, but it's a much more fun idea. Tag it out.
It's also important to emphasize that calling it the dark side of the moon is actually a misnomer, because even that side is brightened by the sun. Just depends on where the Earth-Moon system is oriented. And so what we call sometimes the dark side of the moon can actually be entirely bright. And the part that is faced to us, because it's faced away from the sun, is like the new moon without any light in it. So maybe the better designation would be the obscure side of the moon or something like that. It's occluded from view. The moon is kind of synced between its rotation and translation, and so it's always presenting the same side to us, the same face to us.
I was going to say I was thinking the shy side of the moon, since
it's also cool.
Face away from us, tag.
Yeah, if you want to tease someone who says they've never seen the dark side of the moon, you've never seen a solar eclipse.
Or when it's a new moon, and sometimes you can kind of see a faint sliver that's already being brightened, but the rest of the moon isn't visible per se because it's dark, but you can kind of infer that there's a disk there, of course. So
it's can perceive the absence of the rest of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna just to add on to what Graham said about perceiving the potential for a harm. I think it could go either way. I think some people, I think there could be individual differences. Some people could sort of experience a sense of danger and a desire to run without necessarily even thinking tiger, although other people may have a very clear idea that tiger, run, and I think you could parse up the mind in different ways, and then Nyaya school have parsed up the mind, and talk about expectancies and expected values and all those kinds of things that they don't talk about. It is worth talking about expected values, especially in the context of decision theoretic planning. So yeah, when you talked about a potential danger or perceiving potential danger and an expectation of danger or something like that, I kind of thought of a reinforcement learning agent that does value function learning, and the value function is just the expected value, or a function that gives the expected value of taking an action in a given state, sort of updating the value function based on new information that comes in, and expecting sticking around to have a low expected value, and expecting running away to have a higher expected value based on the new information. So yeah, there are many other ways to parse up the mind into like ontologies for psychology that work for different purposes. Yeah, I think I've repeated myself enough about how I don't think it makes too much sense to try to argue strictly for the absolute superiority of any one way to divvy it up. I think part of what the Nias wanted to do was to say, like, for those people who hear a growl and they think tiger, run, it's fair to say they've perceived a tiger, or it's in some cases it's fair to say they've perceived a tiger, and in other cases it's fair to say they've done a legitimate inference. I think in this episode we're discussing it's more about they've done legitimate inference, and to give an example where that inference, like making those kinds of inferences, obviously a very valuable thing to do, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say, no, the ideal is you just want to perceive in the moment the sound you're hearing and just allow your body to really feel into what it feels like to perceive that sound, and sit right where you are and continue your meditation and not do anything about that. It'd be really dumb to respond to a growl of a tiger behind you that way in that context. You want to run, so you want to go from your perceptions and make inferences and make better decisions based on those inferences. So I think, yeah, for that purpose, I kind of like the example, and I like the way they've divided it up. Although there's a lot of richness in, or there's a lot of richness to be had in thinking of terms of potential harms and potential gains and expected values and that kind of thing also. So it just depends what kind of point you're trying to make at the end of the day. I think in what context.
Very good points. That's points well taken. Forest trees, and I admit I'm showing my economist bias there. And one thing you can tell that these Indian sages, they were totally unaware of Marshall Rosenberg, because they never, I think, considered the idea of trying nonviolent communication with tag.
Yeah, probably not. Though they say that the yogis, if they are masters, they can even speak to other animals. So maybe they could just tell the tiger to sit down and chill.
Do nonviolent communication. When I heard you growl, I felt fear. I don't know.
What is the opposite of pissy when we see a big cat?
I don't know. That's a Portuguese version of that.
So when we see a cute, when we see a cute cat, we kind of say pss, 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 with peas. Yeah, the opposite of this. Yeah, but probably, I think running is the best choice here. You're not going to take any chances. But I think that it depends. Yeah, I think it depends on the person. If it's a person that's really accustomed to traveling in the forest, in that particular forest, maybe even distinguishes by the growl the particular tiger that he's already encountered several times. I even knew that people who worked in the forest even use even nowadays head masks with the face on the backside of the face, because it seems that the tigers, they only want to surprise attack people. If they perceive that the people are kind of aware of them, even if just through the illusion of a back turned face mask, they tend to not attack, which is it's kind of amusing. But I think that people who recognize, even by the sound, the tiger, they recognize, well, that tiger is really big and aggressive, and I'm close to it due to the sound. All this just in a fraction of a few seconds, and so I must run like hell, because proximity with this tiger is very, very dangerous. It's danger in terms of bodily harm, really severe bodily harm. So they will be running, even imagining what the tiger can do to them as they inference away while they run away. Probably at first a very blunt and crude inference, but as they run, their mind continues to do inferences and refine the inferences to particularize even. So maybe that is a thing.
Yeah, cats have perception systems that it's difficult to imagine what it's like to be a cat. There are lots of, actually it's similar to the example of mistaking a coiled rope for a snake. There are lots of examples of sort of videos of cats on the internet where their owners just conspicuously put a cucumber next to the cat behind the cat. The cat's losing their minds about the cucumber and jumping.
They jump like 2 meters in the air because they probably are literally identifying it with a scaly predator that might be a snake or a lizard, a big lizard or something like that. Yeah, maybe it's some kind of innate predator recognition pattern of cognition that they have innately. These house cats that have never seen a reptile in their lives, and they just lose their shit with a cucumber. Yeah, scientifically cats are fun, even if amateur science wise.
Yeah.
Should we call it today? Go ahead.
Yeah. Regarding the episode, I don't have any more comments on the Niana teaching about reasoning. I'm a little tired. We had a long chat today already. Happy calling it a day. Graham, any final thoughts?
No, it's been a pretty good episode. Enjoyed having Wolfie on for a change. Always great to have more contributors, and always fun with you guys. Thanks.
So there's these dangerous creatures, and also the tiger, which is relatively also dangerous.
Tigers will not divorce you, so at least there's not that danger.
Yeah, you just feed them once with your body.
With tigers, the pain's over in a day. There's something to be said for that. Let me just out.
Tigers have something going for them.
Okay, yeah, thanks guys, and thanks to Wolfie for joining. I enjoyed that as always, and looking forward to the next one.
And we'll still be on Niaya.
Yeah, hopefully finishing it next time.
Yeah.
Cool.
See you guys. Ciao.